In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with the fabulous Python module called Pygame 0. And we can use this module to create simple and some complex 2D games using Python. And as you can see, I'm still using the Mu editor. So the first thing we need to do is switch mode. You can see I'm in the Python mode. It says it down here in the bottom right hand corner of my screen. So I'm just going to click on mode and I'm going to switch to the Pygame 0 mode. And I get my buttons change ever so slightly. The text on some buttons change. I get some new buttons. And also down in the bottom right hand corner here, I can see that I'm now in the Pygame 0 mode. And I have already got two functions written. I have a draw function and I have an update function. And as part of Pygame 0 will call these functions for you. There are a few functions that if you write them and if they're in your program, you don't have to call them. Pygame 0 will actually call them for you. So that's quite a difference to what you might have been used to prior to this. So typically in Python, when you want to write a function and call a function, you typically write the function and then you have to call it. Here, when you're working with Pygame 0, there are a few functions, or certain functions, that if you write them, Pygame 0, the system, so to speak, or Pygame 0, the engine, you can think of it, it will call the functions for you. So two of those functions are the draw function and the update function. So if you write a draw function, and it has to be spelled exactly like this, small letters, for example, small capitals. If you write a draw function, the Pygame 0 system, or the Pygame 0 engine, will call that draw function, and it will call it every time it feels like it needs to redraw the screen. So for example, if you're writing a game and someone is moving on the screen, well, it will be constantly redrawing the screen to show that movement. The update function, if you write an update function, again spelled like that, again the Pygame 0 engine, I'll call it, will call that function, and it will call it every frame. So typically that means 60 frames per second, 60 times a second. So the update function is constantly being called. Pygame 0 is constantly calling the update function. Update. It's been called 60 times a second. And if that update function does anything to the screen that Pygame 0 feels it needs to redraw the screen again, then Pygame 0 will call the draw function. So let's see it in action. I've got a draw function and I just print out this is the Pygame 0 draw function. I've got an update function and it prints out this is the update function. I also here inside of my draw function, it looks like I'm accessing an object called screen and I'm calling a function on the object clear. Now I didn't create any object called screen. But again, when you're using the Pygame 0 module, the Pygame 0 engine within the Mu editor, it automatically creates an object for you called screen that you can use. And this screen object represents your computer screen or the game screen. So screen.clear is actually clearing the screen, and then screen.color is a variable that I'm creating, and it's actually, I'm setting it equal to a tuple. So we've seen tuples before, and tuples are like lists, but they're lists that don't change. They're what they call immutable lists. They're sort of like constant lists. And the way you create a tuple is typically, there's a few ways, but typically you would have a normal bracket and then your items in your tuple separated by a comma and then a close bracket. So I'm creating a variable to hold a tuple, and there's three items in the tuple: 128, 0, and 0. So three numbers. And actually, I've read the documentation on Pygame 0, and tells me that there is a function called fill on this screen object that you have access to, and if you pass it a tuple, and if that tuple has 3 numbers, well then it will use those 3 numbers to color in the background of the screen. And the way it does it is this represents, the first number in the tuple represents the amount of red. So this is like mixing paint. This number represents red, this number represents green, and this number represents blue. They call it an RGB value. So it's like getting red paint, green paint, and blue paint and mixing them together. So I'm putting in like 128, let's say, cups of red paint, no cups of green, and no cups of blue. So this is just going to be totally red, this color. And then I pass that tuple to the fill function. So the reason, of course, I had to create the tuple is I read the documentation, and it said if you want to call the fill function, you have to pass it a tuple, and that tuple has to have 3 numbers, and those numbers represent the amount of red, green, and blue you want to mix for the background color of your screen. Okay, let's give it a go. See what happens. I press the play, and there you go. We get a screen appearing, and it is indeed quite red. And you can see here that this is the update function, this is the Pygame zero draw function, and it's been constantly called. Yeah, it's like constantly. It is like a few times a second. These are being called. So it's constantly calling the draw, and it's constantly calling the update. So I knew the update was going to be called. The update is being called 60 times a second. And it's also refreshing the screen constantly as well. And that's sort of the start of how you'd create a game in Pygame 0. So it's the very start. Now what we have to do, of course, is try to place characters on this screen and start trying to move them and the like.